My sister slept with my husband, got pregnant, stole $200,000 from our parents, and then had the nerve to show up at my door at 11:30 at night, soaking wet in the rain, begging me to save her. That night, standing in my doorway with a glass of wine still warm in my hand, I looked at the woman who had spent 30 years destroying everything I ever built, and I felt something I never expected to feel. Nothing. Not anger. Not grief. Not even pity. Just a deep, quiet stillness, like the moment after a storm finally passes and the air goes completely calm. But let me back up, because this story didn't start that night on my doorstep. It started the day I was born into the wrong position in my family. The day my parents looked at their two daughters and decided, without ever saying the words out loud, that one of us mattered more than the other. I was the responsible one, the steady one, the daughter they never had to worry about. What they never told me was that never having to worry meant never having to care. And while they were busy not worrying about me, my sister Melissa was busy burning my entire life down. This is my story. And I promise you, the ending will shock you. Before the story continues, thank you for being here. Take a second to tell me where you're watching from in the comments. Here we share true-to-life revenge stories where the ignored, humiliated, and betrayed rise quietly, and make it count. I truly enjoy seeing how far these stories travel and hearing from you directly. One important note. Some elements in this story have been fictionalized for educational and storytelling purposes, and any resemblance to real people or settings is coincidental. That being said, the message I'm sharing is meaningful, and I hope it speaks to you. Melissa was born beautiful. I mean the kind of beautiful that makes strangers stop mid-sentence and stare. By the time she was 5, she had already learned that her smile could get her almost anything she wanted. I was 8 years old when I first understood what I was in our family. A ghost. Not invisible exactly. More like background furniture. Something people knew was there but never really looked at. Mom called me her steady one. She said it like it was a compliment. It took me 20 years to realize it wasn't. Steady meant safe. Safe meant boring. Boring meant forgettable. Melissa had a tantrum. Everyone rushed over. Melissa made the school play. The whole family drove 2 hours to watch. Melissa failed her math test. Dad sat with her every night for a month until she passed. When I made honor roll 3 years in a row, Mom said, "That's nice, sweetheart," and went back to helping Melissa pick out her homecoming dress. I told myself it was fine. Kids in families sometimes get different amounts of attention. That's normal, right? But it wasn't attention they were giving Melissa. It was permission. Permission to take whatever she wanted without consequences. And eventually she took everything. I was 14 years old when I learned exactly what kind of person my sister was going to become. I had been saving for 4 months. Every dollar I earned from my after-school job at the local bookstore went into a little envelope I kept in my sock drawer. $47. Felt like a fortune to me. And I spent every single penny of it on this gorgeous vintage dress, cream-colored with tiny blue flowers, for my 9th grade homecoming. I hung it in my closet with the tags still on. I remember running my fingers over the fabric before school that Friday morning, already imagining how it would feel to walk into that gym feeling beautiful for once. I came home that afternoon and it was gone. Melissa had seen it. Needed it for some last-minute party she'd been invited to. Mom had simply handed it over without asking me. "She needed it more than you did," Mom said when I stood there with tears burning in my eyes. "You can always get another dress." I never got another dress that year. And Melissa never once said sorry. But here's the twist that made it so much worse. I found out 2 weeks later that she told everyone at that party the dress was a gift from her boyfriend. She hadn't just stolen my dress. She had erased me from the story entirely. At some point you make a choice. You either let the world decide who you are or you decide for yourself. Chose myself. I threw everything I had into school. Not to impress my parents. I'd given up on that by sophomore year. I studied because knowledge was something nobody could take from me. It was mine in a way that nothing in that house ever was. While Melissa floated through high school on her looks and her laugh, I quietly built something real. 4.0 GPA. 3 AP classes. Editor of the school newspaper. A letter of recommendation from my English teacher that made me cry in the parking lot behind the gym. When my college acceptance letter arrived. Full scholarship to a university 3 states away. I expected at least a dinner. Something. Instead, Melissa picked that exact evening to announce she'd broken up with her boyfriend and was absolutely devastated. Mom spent the whole night on the phone with her while I sat alone at the kitchen table, my acceptance letter still in my hand. Dad patted my shoulder on his way to the kitchen for more ice cream. "We always knew you'd do well," he said. Like it was nothing. Like I hadn't worked for 5 years for that single piece of paper. I left for college 2 months later. And I didn't look back. I want to be honest about something. Before I met David, I didn't know what it felt like to be truly seen. I thought I did. I'd had boyfriends in college. Nice enough guys who liked me fine. But none of them had ever made me feel like I was the most interesting person in the room. I had spent so many years being invisible that I think part of me had just accepted it as a permanent condition. Then I went to a marketing conference in Chicago on a rainy October Tuesday, and there was David at the front of a conference room, talking about digital strategy with this quiet confidence that made everyone lean forward in their seats. During the Q&A session, I raised my hand and shared an idea I'd been developing for months. Half the room turned to look at the new voice. David stopped talking. Then he smiled. Not the polite, dismissive smile I was used to, but a real one. "That's brilliant," he said. "Can we talk after this?" We talked for 4 hours. Over coffee, then dinner, then a walk along the river in the cold. He asked me questions like my answers mattered. He listened like he was memorizing me. For the first time in my entire adult life, I didn't feel like someone's afterthought. I should have known that feeling was too good to last. David proposed on a Tuesday evening in our tiny apartment, with a ring that wasn't flashy but was exactly, perfectly right. I said yes before he finished the sentence. Planning our wedding should have been the happiest time of my life. And for about 3 weeks it was. Then Melissa found out. She had just broken up with her latest boyfriend, some man she'd been dating for 2 months who she described as the love of her life, and was apparently too emotional to handle the idea of her older sister getting married. Every decision I made became about her feelings. The venue I chose was where she'd had her first date with her ex. The date I picked was too close to their breakup anniversary. My choice of bridesmaid dress color was insensitive because it reminded her of something painful that I never fully understood. "Can't you just be more considerate?" Mom said during one phone call that left me shaking with frustration. "She's really struggling right now." For the first time in my adult life I said no. I held every boundary firm. My wedding, my date, my venue, my colors. Melissa cried through the entire ceremony and left before the cake was cut. But I danced with my husband until midnight and didn't feel guilty about it for a single second. It would be the last truly happy night I can remember for a long time. 3 years into our marriage, David and I had built something I was genuinely proud of. A house with a real garden. Consulting business growing faster than I'd dreamed. Conversations that lasted hours. A future we talked about with excitement. I was in a client meeting on a Thursday afternoon when my phone buzzed with a message from a number I didn't recognize. I almost didn't read it. "Check your husband's phone. Park Hotel. Room 412. Every Tuesday for 6 months. My client was still talking. Something about quarterly projections. I smiled and nodded and felt my whole body go cold from the inside out. I told myself it was spam. A mistake. Someone messing with the wrong number. But my hands wouldn't stop shaking for the rest of that meeting. And when I drove home that evening, I took every turn slower than usual, like part of me already knew what was waiting and was buying time before I had to face it. David was in the shower when I got home. I sat on the edge of our bed, holding his phone, staring at the screen. The rational part of my brain said, "Put it down." But the part of me that had survived 30 years of being overlooked, dismissed, and lied to, that part said, "You already know. You've known for weeks. Look." So I looked, and my life ended. I want you to understand what it feels like to read the story of your own betrayal in real time. It's not like the movies. There's no dramatic music. No slow collapse to the floor. You just sit there very still reading words that rearrange the entire shape of your reality, and you keep thinking, surely this is the last message, surely it stops here, but it doesn't stop. 8 months of text. Hundreds of them. Sweet at first, then warm, then intimate, then deeply, devastatingly close in a way that went far beyond anything physical. He'd told her things about our marriage. Private things. Vulnerable things I had shared with him in the dark at midnight, when you say the parts of yourself you don't show anyone else. And she had responded with sympathy and understanding and perfect, practiced softness. I saw the hotel booking receipts. Tuesdays. Always Tuesdays. The client lunch that didn't exist. The Peterson Industries account that was a lie from the very beginning. I was going to close the phone. Walk away. Make a decision tomorrow when I could breathe. Then I saw the contact name. M with a small heart emoji. I scrolled back to the top of the thread. Found the first message. Found the number. I had seen that number 1,000 times on family group texts. My hands finally started shaking. It was my sister's number. I sat on that bathroom floor for a long time. The shower was still running. Steam was creeping under the bathroom door. David was humming something I didn't recognize, which somehow made it worse. The idea that he could hum while my world was falling apart on the other side of the wall. I read every message twice. Then a third time. Not because I needed more proof, but because I kept searching for the moment it was not what I thought it was. The moment the story had a different ending. Didn't. It had started, according to the texts, when David reached out to Melissa to help plan a surprise for my birthday. My birthday. She had used my own celebration as a door to walk through. The planning had turned into private jokes. The jokes had turned into coffee. The coffee had turned into something I couldn't name without my throat closing up. The worst part. Reading the messages, I could see exactly how she had done it. The same way she had always done everything. With warmth and charm and the specific kind of attention that makes you feel like the only person on earth. She had used her greatest skill. The one that had gotten her everything her whole life, and she had used it on my husband. The shower turned off. I heard the curtain rings scrape the rod. I put the phone back exactly where I found it, walked to the kitchen, and poured myself a glass of water with hands that barely shook at all. I had made a decision. I didn't confront David that night, or the night after. I needed time to think, and thinking clearly has always been my greatest strength in a crisis. I went through the motions for 3 days. Made coffee. Smiled at dinner. Asked about his week. He had no idea. And that gap between what he thought was happening and what I knew was actually happening, that was the first moment I had ever held any power in my marriage. It felt cold and hollow, but it was mine. On the 4th day, I received a second anonymous text from the same unknown number. Ask Em about her doctor's appointment yesterday. My whole body went rigid. I sat with that text for 1 hour. Then I called Melissa on the pretense of checking in. She answered on the second ring, bright and cheerful, asking about my week like a person with a completely clear conscience. Everything okay with you? I asked. Tiny pause. Of course. Why? Just checking in. Haven't heard from you in a while. I'm great, she said. Actually, I have some news soon. I'll tell the family when I'm ready. She was giggling when she hung up. I set my phone face down on the kitchen counter, and I stared at the wall for a very long time. The news she was saving. The doctor's appointment. The secret she was keeping. Already knew. I think I had known before I even made the call. I chose a Sunday morning. Quiet. No distractions. The kind of morning that feels normal right before it becomes unforgettable. David was reading the newspaper at the kitchen table with his coffee going cold beside him. The way he always let it go cold, the way I had always found oddly endearing, right up until that morning when I found it unbearable. I sat down across from him, folded my hands on the table, looked at him carefully. This man I had chosen above every other person. This man who had made me feel seen for the first time in my life. How long has it been going on with Melissa? He asked. The newspaper dropped. His face did something complicated that lasted about 4 seconds. Then all of it collapsed. The whole performance of being my husband just fell off him like a coat he'd been wearing too long. "I never meant for this to happen," he said, head in his hands. "People say that like it means something. Like the absence of intention erases the presence of action." "How long?" I asked again, my voice perfectly steady. 8 months, he whispered. Months. While I was building my business and planning our future and talking about having children. He was building a second life with my sister. I nodded once, stood up, poured his cold coffee down the sink. "I want you out by Friday," I said. And I meant it. I gave myself exactly 24 hours before I called Melissa. I needed one more day to feel the floor beneath my feet, to make sure I wouldn't say something I couldn't take back. She picked up with that same bright voice. But this time there was a hesitation before the brightness kicked in. Like she had been waiting for this call. "I know," I said. No preamble. No build-up. Silence. Then she started crying. And I want you to hear this clearly. She started crying before she said a single word of apology. Tears came first. The performance came first. Just like it always had. "It wasn't supposed to happen this way," she sobbed. "It just happened naturally. We didn't plan it." "You plan hotel rooms," I said. "You plan Tuesday afternoons. None of that just happens." More crying. Then came the word I had been waiting for. "But." "There is always a but with Melissa. But you were so busy. But David felt lonely. But you never really seemed happy anyway." As if my marriage was a puzzle she had simply solved better than me. Then she told me about the baby. Not gently. Not with any real remorse. Just blurted it out mid-sentence. Like a weapon she'd been holding in reserve. Hung up. Walked to my car. Sat in the driveway. And I made myself a promise I have kept every day since. Never again. I thought, in the very bottom of my heart, that this time would be different with my parents. I sat across from them in their living room. The same living room where Christmas mornings had happened, where family dinners had been eaten, where I had spent a lifetime being the ghost in the corner. And I told them everything. The text. The hotel. The 8 months. The pregnancy. Mom's hands went to her mouth. Dad's jaw tightened. I saw real pain cross their faces, and for one shining moment I thought, this is it. This is the moment they finally choose me. Then Dad said, "These things happen." The words landed like a slap. These things happen. As if David and Melissa had been caught in the rain instead of conducting a months-long deliberate betrayal. As if happening removed responsibility. Mom nodded and moved straight into problem-solving mode. Melissa was scared. The baby needed stability. The family needed to pull together. "What about what I need?" I asked. I kept my voice very quiet. I genuinely wanted to hear the answer. The silence that followed was the loudest thing I have ever experienced. They looked at each other, then back at me. And in that moment I understood something I should have understood at 14, standing in my empty closet, staring at the space where my dress used to hang. Some lessons you have to learn more than once before they finally stick. This was the last time I waited for my parents to choose me. Divorce papers. 2 words. 12 letters. And the most powerful decision I had ever made in my life. I called a lawyer on a Monday morning, the same Monday I had scheduled a client presentation for 10 a.m. I did both things with the same clear-headed focus, because falling apart was simply not an option I was willing to give myself. David didn't fight anything. I think he was relieved to stop pretending. We divided everything quickly, without bitterness. The way 2 people divide things when they both know the relationship was already over long before the papers made it official. I sold the house. Took my half of every shared account. Packed my things into boxes over one quiet weekend while David stayed at a hotel and the neighbors pretended not to watch. I found a downtown loft with floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the city at night. Standing in it for the first time, empty and echoey and completely mine, I felt something crack open in my chest. Not grief. Something closer to relief. Like I had been holding my breath for years without realizing it. And I was finally allowed to exhale. I didn't know it then. But I was about to discover that starting over at 33 was not a punishment. It was the best thing that ever happened to me. The Sarah that had been shrinking her whole life was gone. Someone new was standing in those windows. And she was just getting started. Something happens to a person when they have nothing left to lose. A kind of fearlessness kicks in that no amount of comfortable living could ever produce. I threw myself into my consulting business with everything I had. Every client call, every proposal, every late night at my desk was fueled by one simple thought. I am going to build something so undeniable that no one will ever be able to overlook me again. Within 6 months, my client base had doubled. Within a year, I had hired 2 employees and was turning away business because I couldn't keep up with demand. Word spread the way it does when the work is genuinely good. I started getting invited to speak at conferences. An industry publication quoted me as an expert. A major corporation I had been following for years sent me an email asking if I was available for a consultation. I remember sitting at my desk when that email came in my little downtown loft with the city lights twinkling below me, and laughing out loud. Not the bitter kind. The real kind. The kind that comes from deep in your stomach when life suddenly makes sense. I opened a second office in Seattle. Hired a full team. I wore whatever I wanted to client meetings and nobody told me I was taking up too much space. For the first time in my life, the story I was living was the one I had written for myself. Nobody had handed it to me. Nobody could take it away. 6 months into my new life, I started seeing a therapist named Dr. Martinez. Not because I was falling apart, I wasn't. But because I was smart enough to know that surviving something doesn't automatically mean you've understood it. I wanted to understand it. Our first few sessions were uncomfortable in the best possible way. Dr. Martinez had this skill for asking exactly the question you'd been avoiding, at exactly the moment you were most convinced you'd already answered it. "Why do you think you stayed invisible for so long?" she asked in our third session. "Because that's how my family saw me," I said. She shook her head. "They saw you the way you allowed them to see you. What did you get from staying small?" That question sat in my chest for 2 weeks. The answer, when it finally came to me, was humbling. I had stayed small because small felt safe. If you never claim a space, no one can take it from you. If you never want too much, you can't be disappointed. If you accept whatever the world gives you, at least you're never surprised. I had built my invisibility as a form of self-protection. And it had cost me everything. "You spent so many years being the supporting character in other people's stories," Dr. Martinez said in our 8th session, "that you forgot you could be the heroine of your own." I wrote that down. I still have it on my office wall today. I want to be very honest about something. I didn't sit around watching Melissa's life fall apart and feel happy about it. Mostly I felt tired. The news reached me in pieces through mutual friends and the occasional unavoidable family update. David had lost his job about 8 months after our divorce. It turned out that the Peterson Industries account, the client lunch he had been using as cover for his Tuesday afternoons, had never existed. He'd been filing fake expense reports, billing the company for hotel rooms and dinners that had nothing to do with work. He was escorted out of the building on a Friday morning. I heard he cried. Without his income, the picture-perfect life he and Melissa had been building together started showing cracks almost immediately. She had never been particularly good at managing money. She'd always had someone else to manage it for her. And David, it turned out, had always been better at appearing financially stable than actually being it. He started missing child support payments. Then he missed visits with little Sophie. Then he moved to another state, telling people he needed a fresh start, as if fresh starts were something you deserved without ever doing the work. Melissa was left alone with a baby, a broken lease, and a string of bad decisions that had finally all come due at once. I wish this felt like victory. But watching someone you once loved finally face the consequences of hurting you doesn't taste like anything at all. Just tastes like time passing. 3 years after my divorce, my father called me from a number I almost didn't recognize. His personal cell, which he almost never used. His voice sounded older than I remembered. Heavy in a way that made me sit down before he even said anything. "We need to talk," he said. "Can you come over tonight?" I drove to my parents' house expecting many things. An illness maybe. A money problem. Some new Melissa drama requiring a family summit. I was not expecting what I found. They were sitting in the living room with papers spread across the coffee table. Bank statements. Legal documents. Something that looked like a police report. Mom's hands were shaking. Dad looked like he hadn't slept in days. The story came out slowly in pieces. Melissa had been stealing from them for months. Not small amounts. Forged checks. Credit card charges they hadn't authorized. A loan taken out against their house using documents she had faked. The amounts were staggering. Enough to seriously threaten everything they had spent 40 years building. But the thing that finally broke them, the thing that moved them from disbelief to action, was the discovery that she had been selling items from their house. My mother's jewelry. My father's watch collection. Family heirlooms meant to last generations. She had been taking it piece by piece, counting on their love to keep them from looking too closely. Dad looked up at me across that table and I saw, maybe for the first time, that he was ashamed. After my father finished explaining what Melissa had done, after the police report had been described and the bank statements had been turned over and Mom had cried through most of it, a silence fell over the living room. Then my mother looked at me and said, "We owe you an apology." I held very still. Not a general apology. Not the kind of vague sorry that means nothing and costs nothing. A specific, detailed, honest accounting of every way they had failed me. The dress at 14. The college acceptance letter. The wedding. The divorce. Every moment they had chosen Melissa's feelings over my reality. We enabled her, my father said. Not as an excuse. Just as a fact stated plainly, by a man who had finally run out of ways to avoid it. And we failed you. As parents, and as people who should have seen your worth all along. I sat very quietly while my parents apologized to me. I had spent so many years imagining this conversation, replaying different versions of it in my mind, that now that it was actually happening, I didn't quite know what to do with it. I didn't cry. I didn't rage. I didn't tell them it was fine. I just said, "Thank you for telling me." And then Mom reached across the table and handed me a folder. "There's something else," she said. I opened the folder. And the number at the bottom of the last page made my hands go perfectly, completely still. I counted the zeros 3 times. $37 million. My parents, the people who drove practical cars and took one vacation a year and never once mentioned money at the dinner table, had quietly, carefully, over 40 years, built a fortune that no one in the family had known about. My father's small accounting firm had grown into a regional company before he sold it for far more than anyone realized. My mother's real estate investments and stock picks had been compounding silently in the background for decades. They lived modestly because they chose to, not because they had to. And now they were leaving it all to me. "This isn't about punishing Melissa," Dad said carefully. "This is about recognizing the daughter who chose to build something real. Who chose responsibility when it would have been easier to choose chaos." I sat with that folder in my hands for a long time. I want to be honest. I didn't feel triumph. I didn't feel vindicated in any simple way. What I felt was something more complicated and more quiet. Like standing at the end of a very long road you've walked in the dark and finally seeing that the road did, in fact, lead somewhere. Like understanding for the first time that being the steady one was never a consolation prize. It was always the whole point. I closed the folder. Looked at my parents across the table. "Thank you," I said again. And this time I meant something entirely different. She found out within 4 days. I don't know how. Melissa has always had a talent for finding out things she isn't supposed to know. She can work a phone tree and a mutual acquaintance faster than most people can tie their shoes. And news like a $37 million inheritance doesn't stay quiet in a small family no matter how tightly you hold it. The phone calls started that same week. I let them go to voicemail. Each one was a different strategy. The first few were angry, high-pitched and sharp, accusing our parents of betrayal and me of somehow manipulating everything behind the scenes. Then came the guilt-heavy ones, the slower calls where she cried and talked about Sophie and the new baby she was expecting and how family was supposed to stick together. Then came the threats, vague ones at first, then more specific. She was going to get a lawyer. She was going to contest the will. She was going to tell everyone that our parents had lost their minds. Then she showed up at my office building. I wasn't there when it happened, but my assistant called me immediately. Melissa in the lobby, voice raised, demanding to see me. Security had to escort her out. She made enough of a scene that it ended up in a local gossip blog. A photo of her with baby Sophie on her hip, claiming I had stolen what was rightfully hers. I read the blog post once, closed the tab, and went back to work. It was a Tuesday night, 11:30. I was in my living room with a glass of wine and a book I'd been meaning to finish for 2 months, when the intercom buzzed. I checked the security camera. Melissa. She was standing on my doorstep in a wrinkled designer dress I recognized from her Instagram. Her pregnant belly pushing against the fabric, mascara running down her face in dark lines. She looked like she had been crying for hours, maybe days. I stood there for a moment watching the camera feed, and I felt that stillness I told you about at the very beginning of this story. That deep, quiet calm that had nothing to do with cruelty and everything to do with clarity. I went downstairs and opened the door. She looked at me with red-rimmed eyes and said, "Please." Just that one word, hanging in the night air between us. She told me she had been living in her car, that she'd lost her apartment, lost her job. David was gone again. Apparently she'd reconnected with him just long enough for one more catastrophic decision. She had nowhere to go. Her parents wouldn't answer. No one was answering. "I have nothing," she said. "But you have everything now. Please, Sarah. I'm your sister." I looked at her for a long time without saying anything, because what came next was the most important decision I had ever made. Not for her. For me. I want you to understand something before I tell you what I said. This was not a cold woman who felt nothing. I felt everything standing at that door. I felt the weight of 30 years pressing down on me. The dress, the wedding, the phone, the hotel room numbers, the sound of her voice when she told me about the baby like it was something she was proud of. I felt all of it at once like weather. And underneath all of that, yes, I felt something real for the woman standing in front of me. She was my sister. We had shared a childhood. I remembered her at 7 years old, chasing fireflies in the backyard, laughing so hard she fell over in the grass. But here's what I had learned over the past 3 years, in therapy and in business and in the long, quiet hours of rebuilding a life from the ground up. There is a difference between love and sacrifice. A difference between compassion and rescue. A difference between being kind and being a solution to consequences someone else created. "I'm sorry you're in this situation," I said. And I meant every word of it. "But this is not my responsibility to fix." She brought up Sophie. The new baby. 2 innocent children caught in the mess of her choices. My heart did ache for them. Genuinely, truly ached. Which is exactly why, I told her steadily, you need to make better choices. Not for me. For them. I went inside, retrieved a piece of paper, and handed her a list of every shelter, every assistance program, every support service for single mothers in our city. She screamed at me. "I want you to know that." She didn't take the list quietly or nod and walk away with dignity. She screamed. She said I was heartless, cold, selfish. She said that David had come to her because I was emotionally unavailable, as if my husband's affair was really a character flaw in me that she had simply responded to. She said our parents had lost their minds and she was going to fight for everything she deserved. I stood there and let her say all of it. And then, when she ran out of words, I said something very quietly that I had been carrying for years without knowing it. What I got from Mom and Dad wasn't money, Melissa. What I got was 37 years of being invisible. What I built came from deciding that wasn't enough anymore. You always had everything handed to you. I had to figure out how to hand things to myself. She opened her mouth again. Closed the door. Gently. Not in anger. The way you close the door on something that has been trying to come back in for 30 years. I turned the deadbolt, walked back to my living room, picked up my wine glass, sat down in my chair, and breathed. That night, for the first time since I was 14 years old, I did not feel guilty for putting myself first. Not even a little. 6 months later, I stood at a podium in downtown Seattle looking out at 200 women, and I told them my story. Not as a tragedy, as a blueprint. The Sarah Matthews Foundation for Women's Entrepreneurship had just made its first round of grants to 12 women starting businesses after devastating setbacks. The kind of women the world had overlooked and underestimated and quietly expected to fail. My kind of women. As I spoke, I thought about Melissa. Not with anger, but with a kind of distant, genuine hope that she had found the help she needed, that her children were safe and warm, that somewhere in the rubble of her choices she had found something sturdy to build on. I didn't wish her harm. I simply no longer carried her pain as my responsibility. My parents came to the foundation launch. They sat in the front row. Mom cried. Dad shook my hand with both of his and didn't let go for a long time. That evening I drove home to a house on a hill that was mine in every way that mattered. A life that was fully, completely, unmistakably mine. I poured a glass of wine, walked onto my balcony, and watched the city lights stretch out below me like a map of every possible future still waiting. My phone buzzed. Text from James. Another from my assistant. One from Dad, just a heart emoji. Simple, quiet, real. The steady one had won. Not by fighting, not by plotting, but by the most powerful act available to any human being who has ever been overlooked. She simply refused to disappear. If this story resonated with you, I'd be grateful if you'd subscribe to this channel for more true stories like this one. Leave a comment below, telling me what you would have done in my situation. I read every single one. Share this story with someone who needs to hear it. Your share might save someone's life. Thank you for staying with me until the very end. I know this wasn't an easy story to hear, and I want to be honest with you, some of the stories that follow contain fictionalized elements created for educational purposes. If that's not something you're comfortable with, feel free to explore other content that suits you better. But if you're willing to learn from real experiences, even painful ones, I'll be here sharing what I've learned. God bless you.